Hello everyone, welcome to another BoardPro webinar in our Governance Made Easy series. Our webinar today is titled Diversity of Thought, Could It Be Your Next Board Superpower? My name's Sean McDonald and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. Firstly, thanks for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here because of course it's Easter and I'm sure a lot of you are heading off to your holiday homes. During our session today, if you have any questions, I should say, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as against the chat button. It's just easier for us to filter them. We'll be answering these during our session and try to get through as many of these as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into a draw to win our beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. For those who don't know BoardPro, we're a board software provider that serve over 20,000 users around the world. We enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with really clever software with less time and deliver more impact and value for the organization. As much as we're a board software provider or a board portal, as we are sometimes called, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Now, everything you see here today, including the webinar recording, the presentation, and the white paper, will be sent to you via email within the next 24 hours. So sit back, enjoy the conversation and ask questions if you are so inclined. So on that note, let me now introduce you to our expert panel for today. Lloyd Mander leads Dot Scorecard, a consultancy that works with boards, executive teams, and other decision-making groups to understand potential for wide-ranging diversity of thought and develop the decision-making culture that is required to release diverse thinking. Lloyd has held governance roles associated with health, housing, transport, entrepreneurship, membership organizations, and governance education. He was previously a co-founder and managing director of a regional healthcare provider. Lloyd holds a master's degree in audiology and business administration. Welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, everyone.
Dr. Susan Mravlik is a principal in InSync's board advisory practice, whose career objective is to help boards and top teams realize their organizational aspirations. Susan's expertise is in deep qualitative research that gets to the heart of what destabilizes board and organizational culture. Susan has worked with boards and top teams across many sectors to improve behaviors and dynamics and help restore cohesion. Susan holds a PhD degree in business from the University of Tasmania and Master of Applied Science degree in Organizational Dynamics from the RMIT University in Melbourne. She spent the last 10 years studying how organizational culture is impacted by disruptive events and how maladaptive systems, gosh, that's a mouthful, and social unrest affect performance and shape behaviors. Welcome to you, Susan.
Thank you. Welcome. It's great to be here.
Now, Paul Smith is being described by many as a board futurist or a boardroom futurist, one of the leading thinkers on the where next for board governance. He speaks right around the world on the themes of board diversity, inclusive decision-making, and the concept and the role of the future director. He's an award-winning author with his first book, Right Seat, Right Table, is currently working on his second, which is called, if I can remember it, Leave Your Ego at the Door, I think, A Guide to Impact and Influence Inside the Boardroom. I think that's what it is. For over 10 years now, Paul has served as chair and non-executive director for a number of companies and organizations in Australia, the United Kingdom, and Europe. Welcome to you, Paul.
Kia ora. Thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
Excellent. So from this point, I will hand over to Lloyd to the proceedings.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. So perhaps first of all, if I might just share a little bit about what got me interested in this area before we move through some of our topics today. So I've been working in this area for about 7 years now, And my original interest in the area really came from personal experiences that I had around the boardroom table. One of them was certainly the fact that the same me would be on one board and I'd feel like we'd have really constructive conversations, we'd build solutions together, everyone would participate and add to what we were coming up with. And other boards, I would be entirely ineffective. People would be over talking others. Some people wouldn't feel comfortable speaking up. People would be checking their emails when they're meant to be part of the board discussion. And that got me a little bit interested in the sort of board dynamic space. And I had one particular experience on a board where we had a project that I was a big fan of. Another board member was not a big fan of the project at all. We did proceed. And in the end, after every time we'd come together, that board member would come up with other reasons for why the project wasn't going to work. And I found that very frustrating at the time. But ultimately, many months down the track, the project got cancelled. But because we'd had that degree of often constructive and helpful challenge through that process, it meant that we were able to foresee that risk and manage it really well. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because I guess it showed me that whilst I thought I had a good approach and my decision-making was sound, there was a lot of value for the board to actually have quite divergent opinions on that particular matter. And that got me doing a lot more research in this space and into where we are today. So I'd like, first of all, just to share some concepts that separate the value that we get from diversity from a appearance, external perspective, and diverse thinking. So first of all, there definitely is value that comes from people looking different. It's one of those things where if we don't see others that look like ourselves in positions of responsibility or leadership, then it's a lot harder for us to aspire to that and participate at those levels. And also organizations that don't have visible diversity, it's a bit of a warning sign that maybe they're not tapping into deep talent pools and things as well. But the overlap between how people look and how they think is not perhaps as close as what some might portray. And today we're very much, of course, going to focus on the thinking side of things. And there are quite a few different benefits from having board members and team members that think differently to each other. Now, one of them certainly is this concept around problem framing. And I'm sure that you've been in situations where you've seen a problem one way and others have seen it different ways. And we actually even encountered preparing for this webinar there and we're figuring something out that interpreted things in different ways. That's quite normal and can actually be really productive too. If we all frame problems the same way, it's going to limit the number of options that we can come up with. We may not be able to identify risks and potential solutions as well. The other real advantage of having people that think differently to each other is that ability to build in each other's solutions. So it may be that your idea is the idea that you proceed with, or it may be that you can contribute an idea that builds on someone else's idea or test that other idea to improve it. And again, that's only possible if we have people that think differently. And then finally, we've got this term groupthink that many of you may be familiar with. And the definition of that has evolved a little bit over time. It really was originally around this concept that you valued your membership on the board or the group so much that you didn't want to rock the boat. So you weren't going to raise objections or concerns or alternative thinking to the group. That's still the case to some degree, but often it's more of a subtle sort of phenomena really where we want people to think we're smart. We might think that people already know what we know, and so therefore we might hold back. And we also see a degree of perhaps convergence in thinking from those that work together closely over a longer period of time. Now, I'd be quite interested from Susan and Paul. Do you have any views on some, have you observed around the boards that you've worked with some of these potential benefits from having some diversity around the boardroom table?
Yes, I've certainly seen that, particularly around where boards have become quite stuck and particularly have been operating at a plateau of inertia and quite stigmatized by the fact that there is an imbalance around in terms of that thinking. And being able to free that up certainly has unlocked the board's potential and helped it realise that it can perform at a much higher level.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd echo those sentiments. I've certainly seen a drive towards thinking differently on the right-hand side, far more than looking differently, and the benefits, putting all of that other stuff to one side, just the benefits of people bringing in different lived experiences and just looking at things from a completely different frame of reference. And you reference the thing that happened to all of us up front, and again, that sort of thing. And what I have seen though, and which I know you're going to cover off later on, is the problems that comes if you don't have the right culture. One of the things I wanted to bring up though was I have found with a lot of boards I've worked with and listened to, they use the thinking differently as an excuse to not accelerate the looking differently element to it, saying that's our ultimate goal. So why should we bring in diversity around gender, age, race, culture, etc.? How would you respond to that?
I would say from my perspective, it's a great question. And I would say it's always an and, not an or. The weighting between those two things might be a little bit affected by the objectives at the time. But in general, I would say, yeah, you can have both. You don't have to go for one or the other. There's value from both, different kinds of value. And where people sometimes slip up, I think, is by assuming that they're going to get cognitive diversity or diversity of thought from just having people that look different. And unfortunately, we do have that sort of natural bias of liking those who are going to fit best within our board. And so I've worked with a number of boards and senior teams where the individual who clearly looks the most different to the others on the board, but when evaluated, actually ends up almost being like the sort of perfect amalgam of everyone else and the most representative thinker of the whole group, but they sure look different. So that's definitely a trap to fall into. But I don't think seeking diversity of thought or cognitive diversity is in any way a replacement from seeking to bring on those that are going to bring other representative diversity metrics and things as well, because there's inherent value from those too. I'm going to move on.
Can I just reflect on something, Lloyd?
Yeah,
really,
sure.
really quickly. One of my mentoring clients is what we would call a 5 or 6-fer from a diversity point of view. She's young, female, Muslim, born overseas, social entrepreneur. I think she's got a few others. So she's in hot demand, but she herself had a very traditional education and upbringing in Auckland, wealthy family, very privileged upbringing. So she thinks of herself as looking the part, but maybe is just like everybody else. So it's really interesting that you can sometimes look like you're diverse, but you may not actually be that diverse based on your upbringing and your education and your exposure and your lived experiences. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at things as well sometimes.
Definitely.
And can I just add to that too? Sorry, I know I'm extending the thinking around this, is also the generational aspects as well too. Quite often there's the misunderstanding of diversity, particularly around older generations, that it's about fairness, equity and espousing sort of civil rights, but then you have the millennials, sorry, I can't get that out, who are very much focused around inclusion and collaborating and do want to have everyone's inputs and experiences valued.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Thank you for that, Susan.
Excellent. Well, what I'm going to do now is, I've used cognitive diversity of thought, a few different terms. So I'd like to define what I mean by diversity of thought. And my sort of personal understanding has definitely evolved a bit over time. And now it has 3 components to it. So the first component really relates to that potential for thinking differently. And that can come from people's lived experiences, as you've described, Paul, with that person there that grew up in a certain way, had a certain type of education, had certain cultural background and associations and things. That's all going to affect your thinking to some degree. And it will manifest in your tolerance of risk and your political beliefs and many things like that. So that's one component of cognitive diversity. And part of that would also be the way you like to address problems and things as well. Also, as you both highlighted, I think, is the importance of culture. And I separate the culture into 2 parts. So the first part is that concept that people can think differently, but unless they're willing to open up and share what they're really thinking, it's not a version of it, but what they're actually thinking, you're not going to achieve diversity of thought. And likewise, on the other side, when people do share what they're really thinking, people have to actually listen and give it due consideration. They can't be checking their email or rolling their eyes in the back of their sockets while people speak. And it's not a case of people having to agree necessarily, but at least give people a fair hearing and understand where people are coming from. And that way we can actually get some constructive movement forward as well.
We have a question. We have a question in from Jane Arnott. Lloyd, this might be for you, actually. We're a non-profit and place a heavy emphasis on values, fit and collaborative style when recruiting new board members. Are we at risk of undermining diversity of thought?
Excellent question, Jane. I would say yes and no. Hopefully no, in the sense that whilst I'm a major advocate for the benefits of diversity of thought, you do have to have some common strands that are going to draw you together. And you've used the term values, which I think is excellent. And in many ways, I think you do have to have alignment of values, but you can have diverse thinking certainly on how those values are going to be espoused and achieved and operationalized. So beyond that sort of one central point, I think you can diverge. I think if people have truly different values, in some circumstances, we can get collaborative and productive diversity of thought out of it. But for an organization like the one I think you've described, common values is great, but as long as in all other respects you're open to, say, different political views or different risk tolerance and other types of diverse thinking markers, then that can be fine. You can manage that risk well. I'm going to move on to a little differentiation now. When we talk about diversity of thought adding value, I'm not one to suggest that it's going to add value to every situation or every problem or everything a board is asked to do. And I'm a big fan of a framework that was developed by Dave Snowden. It was originally publicized in an HBR paper called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. It's a framework described as the Cynefin framework, which is a Welsh term that kind of means habitat. It means a lot more than that. There's not a direct English translation of it. Anyway, it's a framework where you divide decisions into 4 different categories. The first category are decisions that are clear and simple. They're the ones where there's an established best practice. So as a board, if those decisions come to you, it's a case of just making sure the best practice is followed. So quite straightforward, shouldn't require much discussion or decision making. The other end of the spectrum are decisions where the situation is chaotic. So those are situations where the value of getting the perfect decision is actually superseded by the value of making a fast decision to minimize harm and damage. And we can think of situations like if someone has a medical emergency, the best thing is for someone to step in and start to provide appropriate first aid or CPR or whatever's required. That's going to minimize the harm, as opposed to people trying to do things perfectly. Another example would be several years ago with the initial reduction in travel internationally with the COVID pandemic. That was a sensible move to buy time for vaccines to be developed and for different measures to be taken to understand things. So speed is better than perfect when it comes to chaotic. Now, in between those are the kinds of decisions that should come to boards. And so these are things that are complicated or complex. And I'm going to very briefly, and this is a very abbreviated format, help you to understand the difference between those two things, because one of them relates to where diverse thinking boards can add the most value. So complicated decisions are those where there might be many different parts interacting in quite a sophisticated way, but it is somewhat predictable as to the way that they interact. There is inherently a right answer or more than one right answer. And underlying things that are complicated is this concept that there are things you don't know where the gaps are. So you know what you don't know, and so therefore you can put a plug value in, you can use judgment to fill in the gap. And so these complicated decisions are ones where experts add the most value. And when on my favorite car that I drive gets an orange light that sort of blinks on the dashboard there, I take that to the expert, the automotive expert that helps to figure out what it is and how much it's going to cost me. Unfortunately, but it's the best person for that sort of issue. Now, if we go to things that are complex, at the time you make a decision, you cannot predict the outcome based on the information that you've got at hand. So there is no inherent absolute right answer. There may be a probabilistic percentage chance of things happening. There is no definitive right answer when you're looking forward. Looking back, you may be able to say, yep, we made a good call, or no, we didn't. The difference is around these unknowns. So in these complex situations, you don't know what the unknowns are, you don't know where they are, and so therefore you can't fully predict or compensate for them in any way. And now these complex decisions, they're the ones that diverse thinking groups can add the most value to. So as I said, it's not something that diverse thinking groups can add value to every decision. These ones are the ones to focus on. And just to try and give you a chance to engage with these a little bit more, we're going to give you a little bit of a test actually, and you're going to use the chat box for this. So please get your chat box ready if you haven't used it already. Now down the bottom of the screen there, I'm going to reveal a bit of a continuum, because as you can imagine, some decisions, some problems, some opportunities fall on a bit of a spectrum. So sometimes they are way down the complicated end, quite technical. Other times they're way down the complex end, and others in the middle and may have components of complicated and components of complex. And I've also got a numerical scale there as well, from 1 to 7. So if you rate something a 1, it's very much complicated and technical. If you rate it a 7, it's very much complex. Now, another example of, I guess, a complex situation tends to be ecosystems. So natural ecosystems. So if you think the Amazon rainforest, that's quite complex, and even human and organizational ecosystems as well. And things that tend to involve humans tend to be down the complex end of the scale. So if you're ready for your test and have got your chat box ready, the first scenario that I'd like you to think about and respond in the chat box to with a number between 1 and 7 is correctly approving your financial statements. So where would that fall on this spectrum from 1 to 7? That's fantastic. So some great responses coming through there now. And they're largely down to the 1-2 end of the spectrum, which is entirely appropriate. Most people would rate that. Of course, there might be some circumstances where things are less clear, but generally when it comes to a task like that, we just want to make sure that people have the right expertise. So therefore they understand appropriate standards and they can apply them. That's really well done. Now, the next scenario is appointing a successful new chief executive for your organization. So where would that fall on the spectrum there, between 1 down that complicated end of the spectrum and 7 being the complex end of the spectrum? So now we're seeing very much a skew the other way, aren't we? So I think we're seeing very much down the complex end of the spectrum. There are elements of complicated in the sense you can follow some good practices, you're going to conduct interviews, you're going to talk to referees, you're going to look at work history, review the CV, you're going to have done an assessment of what your organization needs. So some of those things you can cover off with good practice and applying expertise. But because I use that word, a successful new CEO, you've correctly picked up, it does put it more down the complex end of the spectrum. And so therefore, you want to apply a bit of diverse thinking to that. So that might be having a group of people that have different perspectives that are involved in the process of deciding who to appoint and that process. And the final one to test you on today is your organization has decided to expand into a new market. So you're going to change the market that you've been providing services to for quite a long time, and you're going into a new one. Where would that sit on this particular spectrum there? That's fantastic. So we've got a sort of a little bit of a spectrum of views, which is absolutely fine. Most people would put this to the middle or towards the complex end of the spectrum. So that would be typical, and I think that's what we're seeing coming through as well. Again, you'll try and apply the expertise that you can. Hopefully you're going into this new market because you've done a sort of sound analysis. In doing so, success is far from guaranteed. And so therefore, being cognizant of the value of having some diverse perspectives is really important. Susan, Paul, any thoughts at this point?
Just around complexity. One of the things that I'd like to add around the complexity of thought with boards and working with uncertainty is when you have diversity of thought present, it actually reduces anxiety around the unknown and certainly ensures that there is a level of comfort, or more so around the board being able to tolerate ambiguity and doubt. And that certainly is evident from my experience.
Yeah, we're living in this increasingly VUCA, what they call VUCA world, that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think boards have to get far more comfortable with not really getting feedback on their decisions, especially as the impact of their decisions go beyond their tenure, potentially. And that's really hard for humans, let alone board directors, to do. I think this is where, again, the diversity of thought comes in, is to create that robust decision-making. And as Susan quite rightly says, that level of extra comfort in ambiguity.
And it's also about being able to push aside one's ego and step away from impression management. And quite often, particularly when a board is about to embark on a very ambitious vision, there's been a significant change in terms of strategy and a major transformation that involves a significant degree of complexity. I think where diversity of thought really helps step away from that is that it just balances the fact that everyone is understanding of what needs to be achieved, rather than getting caught in this spiral of the tacit pressures that are being applied by various stakeholders, internal and external. And that sort of where boards will tend to go back to knowing, or into a space of let's just sit with certainty.
I have a question for you, Lloyd, at this point.
Yes, go for it.
When we have this sort of level of complexity and a lot of different perspectives in the room, I found that boards can have a tendency towards making no decision. They get stuck in decision paralysis because there's so many views, and they're so open and they're so inclusive, and they just can't move forward with a decision. So they don't make any decisions. Like, how can a board manage that?
Now, I use the term appropriate inclusion in decision-making, and that's somewhat based on using a framework like this to make sure that those that are the experts on a particular topic do get delegated a little bit more of the weight of that decision, because they do have some perhaps more fit-for-purpose views, whereas things that are more down the complex spectrum, it's a little bit more even for the way you take things on board. I think for me, it's very much around making sure that you are crystal clear on the objectives. And I guess that the chair needs to keep on bringing people back to the objectives and make sure they're laser focused and not trying to do other nice to do things or other nice to attend to issues. And Yeah, also, it is critical that people do have to reach an actionable consensus. And I think you've described a situation where unlimited diversity of thought is not necessarily the best thing. When we evaluate boards' diversity of thought, we give the boards a score from 0 to 100 on how diverse their potential is. A score of 100 is not the best score on that scale. Probably a score in the 60s is a good place to be. So it's a bit higher than average, but not excessively high. And certainly those that have higher scores really can only perform if they have both quite formed up structure with their processes and also a very capable chair to manage those conversations. So it's definitely it can be a challenge in that sort of circumstance. I'm just going to move on to some research in a minute that we've conducted around this. This is using a tool called the DOT scorecard. The first part of the tool's on the screen now. That's around evaluating that potential for diverse thinking. The other part looks at those cultural elements that we've already touched on a little bit in the conversation. And in this case, it's that appropriate inclusion in decision-making, it's psychological safety, and it's independent expression, so sharing what you're thinking and allowing others to share what they're really thinking as well. And we conducted a study with a number of boards a couple of years ago, and using this, this is using the scale that I've talked about a moment ago, where it's a scale from 0 to 100. So a board with a score of 0 means they're all clones of each other. So they have 0 diversity of thought. Now, no board we've identified is like that, of course, nor is a board ended up with 100 either. But the average score, as per this data here, is into the 50s for boards. So probably the low 50s is an average score, but some boards score quite low, so less than 35 and even lower. Others are higher, well above 65 into the 70s and beyond. And I guess the learning from this data is that there is a spectrum of potential for diverse thinking on boards. So regardless of what they look like, some boards will have quite a lot of diverse thought around the board, others will have much less. And I'm sure those with us today will have been in circumstances, perhaps even in both ends of that spectrum. We can separate boards a little bit too by their size. So again, on this 0 to 100 scale, for 0 being not much no diversity of thought, to 100 being too much. If we have larger boards, we will tend to get more potential for diverse thinking, so more heads, more diversity of thought. But there are some challenges potentially to having more people around the table. And now we're looking at the culture. So this time we're looking at the psych safety, the inclusion, and the independent thinking. And this is measured for boards at a group level on a scale from -100 to +100. And so it's a bigger scale range. And you can imagine if you've got a negative score, then you have a non-enabling culture, whereas if you've got a positive score, it's an enabling culture. Now, fortunately, for smaller boards and larger boards, on average, they had enabling cultures, so that was encouraging to see. It's not always the case with some teams and some senior teams. They tend to score a little bit lower than boards do on average on this measure, but we do get higher scores from smaller boards. So in this case, that's at a range of 5 to 9 people produce more positive, more enabling culture scores, whereas the larger boards less. Susan, Paul, any comments around this?
No, it's more of a question of is there a particular sweet spot if you're on the scale in terms of board size?
Yeah, I would say it is within that 5 to 9 range. So probably 6, 7 to me is a really good size. There will be some context and some sort of fit for purpose, and so it wouldn't be definitive to every board. But for me, yeah, especially as you start getting above that 9 into larger groups. And if you imagine boards don't function in board only time the whole time. So there are management and other people and things with them. So if you think of the people in the room, if your board is 6 or 7 plus you then have others, you're easily getting above 10 with people in the room and part of conversations anyway.
Lloyd, I'm a data nerd, so I love all this stuff, but I worry, and if I might challenge it a little bit, there is that normalization about 6 to 8 being the optimal team size regardless. And I worry that though these assumptions are being led by the data based on, yes, realistic situations of this is how boards are within your sample set. But what about if we looked at changing the way boards operated and actually making them better in terms of their cultural competence and their decision-making culture, regardless of their size? Are we looking at an optimal size based on data of relatively average performing boards, as opposed to actually trying to guide them towards a new way of looking at things and a new way of operating, which makes them better and therefore size is maybe less relevant?
I'd say a bit of both. I'd say, yeah, first of all, definitely my view on that, which I know is not unique to me, others would make that recommendation of that sort of board size based on a different perspective of that sort of 6, 7, 8 individuals. So that for me is very much driven by the data, by working with real boards. I think to your point, which is really around, if we implement things to improve the culture and performance of boards, are we then no longer constrained to that? I would support that. So I would say that I have worked with boards that are larger that have scored very well on this. It is certainly rare in the natural habitat for such things to happen. And it would depend certainly on the capability of the chair and the nature of those who are engaging in that board and their approach to engaging, and also some of the practices and things that they'd use to make sure that people can make a contribution and get their voice through. If you are in, say, a larger group of 12, 13, 14, 15 or more people, it does require the use of tools and technology to make up for some of the challenges that you don't get once you get past a smaller group. So I think, yeah, a fair comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely support what you just shared, Lloyd. I think it's critical in terms of the chair's ability to facilitate those meetings and to ensure that processes are put in place and appropriate structures are put in place to ensure that there is, I suppose, equitable time and voices that are enabled to be heard.
And Lloyd, I think just on this one, there's a question that's come through from Margot Foster about enabling culture. What is your definition of enabling culture?
So for me, my definition would be combining those 3 factors: psychological safety, appropriate inclusion, and independent thinking and expression. And that's based on a literature review of the factors that had the most impact in that situation. So for this measure, that's what it's based on. Now, now we're back to the potential. So this is looking to that scale from 0 to 100 for how much diverse thinking potential a group might have. If we look at it at the board committee level, because of course they deal with some matters on behalf of the full board, and you run that sort of complicated, complex lens, if we look at audit and finance committees versus people and culture committees, both will deal with some complicated and some complex things, but I'd contend that many audit and finance committees might be a bit more focused on the complicated end of the spectrum, like we did with our chat before we got to respond to those 1s and 2s for financial statements. But interestingly, we actually find that they are the ones that have the highest potential score compared to the people and culture committee. So I just share this slide only to give people a little suggestion that you might want to consider committee composition, not purely just based on skills, knowledge, and experience, but actually consider some broader thinking aspects, especially for committees that are dealing with greater complexity.
Lloyd, we have a question in from David Cunningham. He asks, I imagine that the skill for the chair is important in ensuring that the diversity of thought is surfaced and that the loudest voice doesn't dominate. What's the best way to avoid someone dominating or even leading the thinking?
I would, and actually I'm sure that Paul and Susan will have some good answers to this as well, but my initial answer would just be that it needs to be addressed proactively. And so obviously if you enter the situation and it's happening already, it does need to be probably addressed initially outside of the boardroom. So everyone needs to have a sort of shared understanding around the best way that they can contribute, and that an individual that is over contributing or also dominating things there really needs to understand that whilst they may feel that they're appropriately included in the board conversation and decision-making process, by that very nature of their approach to that, it is stopping others from having their contribution made. And that is best pointed out by the chair or a senior board member and things, talking to people outside of meeting time. People will not inherently pick up on that, having worked with a number of organisations, so it does need to be quite explicitly pointed out to them.
And it does need to be called out in the here and now as well too. So the chair needs to be able to comfortably and respectfully, without shutting down that individual, just simply acknowledge their contribution, but at an appropriate time, say in the best interest of time or in the interest of others. It would be great to ensure that we can hear others' thoughts. Can we hear others' inputs on that? But outside of that, one of the things that can be one of the actions that the chair can do with the board is often in terms of collaborating on setting a leadership code. So what are some of the behaviourally, what are some of the norms that the board can collectively agree on in the way that they conduct themselves in meetings, which is quite helpful. And it ties into one of the previous participants' questions around how can you effectively apply values in board processes.
I think if you haven't got a code of conduct or code of ethics or code of behaviour, for your board, which has been, even notionally, when I've chaired boards before, I've had everybody coming on and everybody on the board notionally signing it. It's not a legal document, but essentially it's a way of just acknowledging that this is an agreed way of behaving and interacting with each other and externally, and then it's something you can refer back to. However, I love this question because we run a scenario in some of our board training relating to this, and then we pull a little twist and we say, what if that dominant person is the chair? Lloyd and Susan, what would you do if the dominant person is the chair and they're supposed to be setting the tone from the top? How would you approach that one as a board director?
Lloyd, I'll let you answer first and then I'll certainly share.
I was going to say that you do have to act. I guess that's the main thing. People don't need to not kowtow to the chair because they're the chair. They're only their chair on at the behest of the rest of the board. And yeah, so I guess they need effectively the same treatment. And ultimately it may be that they're not the right person to be the chair at that particular time.
And also, it also invites the opportunity around appropriate mentoring and coaching for that chair as well, too, which is once again a discussion that occurs outside of that forum.
I'm just going to finish with
Lloyd, I'm just doing a time check for us. So we've got another 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to do quite a speedy journey through some ways on supporting culture. Now, Sean mentioned that there will be a white paper shared afterwards, and this will cover all of this. So don't worry that we're going to move through quite rapidly there. We've talked about the importance of psychological safety, which is the concept that people feel safe to be who they are in this context to share what they're thinking. And so we have some suggestions around that. And it's already, I think, come through the conversation, this idea of intellectual humility. For diversity of thought to work, we can feel that we have some ego and we're smart ourselves, but you have to actually be very open to the idea that others are smart too, and others have good ideas and different ideas. And by virtue of their idea being quite different to your idea, that can actually add more value in some ways rather than people simply agreeing with you. We've talked quite a bit about including people in decisions. And so we've run through that even complicated versus complex. It's the complex ones where diverse thinking boards are going to add the most value. They're probably the matters that should have the greatest time on the board agenda as well. And we really want to encourage people to share what they're really thinking. I think we've all been in circumstances where we have, of course, spoken up, but perhaps modified or moderated what we're really thinking to make it more palatable or to get it over the line. That's okay, but it's not going to let people know what you're really thinking, and they're not going to have the benefit of what you're really thinking. And so sometimes technology and tools like polls or providing information in advance is really one of the only ways that you can guarantee that people are going to share an uninfluenced view. As soon as someone speaks, it's going to influence their view.
May I add to this, Lloyd? One of the things that I find in my experience working with boards is not enough time invested in informal sessions outside of meetings. And by that, either at dinners or facilitated sessions where you bring in an external party to facilitate a session just to explore expectations, or in terms of building rapport and fostering talking to your point around psychological safety, so trust. So quite often when you speak individually one-on-one with directors, and certainly I find this through an interview process when I'm conducting evaluations, quite often fears surface, and it's more around how it's perceived that they're being evaluated by others. And often you find even doing a workshop around that really ensures that guards can be dropped so that people can allow each other to be more trusting and open to diversity of thought.
Thanks, Susan. Come to questions. And I think we've answered many of them. I'm just going to check my dashboard to see whether there's any here. No, I think we're all good. If there's any last questions, please put your hand up or pop them into the Q&A box.
Just while we're giving people a chance to that, I'd certainly endorse your description there, Susan. I think in our sort of modern world and modern life, people do suffer from busyness. And I think boards suffer from busyness too, where they're so focused on the matters at hand and the decisions that need to be made and getting through the material that they don't value enough of that sort of informal time, which you described really well as critical.
Oh, and absolutely. And one of the points that you touched earlier on in your presentation is that it's often symptomatic of something that's happening underneath the surface around what's the avoidant behaviour and what's being stifled in terms of the thought or the strategic thinking that can be enabled.
Thanks, Susan. So Sorry, something else, Paul?
Yeah, I was just about to say about, I think what all boards can do is think more about how do we create the conditions for effective governance, effective stewardship and decision-making. It's all well and good putting a group together, but if you're continuously run stressed out board meetings, your board packs aren't the best, most efficient way of conveying information, you're maybe not utilizing technology to make things more efficient. How can you bring in efficiencies around especially the more mundane elements of the boardroom, so you can really look at adding value and doing that interpersonal relationship building, which creates that more inclusive culture. So how do we create the conditions? And that can be as simply as, what does the room set up like if we're physically? Is the lighting conducive to stuff? Is the board table, is that how everybody's seating? Are we rotating seats every board meeting so we're not stuck in our own chair? There's all these simple things as well as more complex things you can do to recreate really good conditions for effective team-based decision-making.
Now, Paul, we have a question come in from Dr. Peter Isdale, which we received earlier, if you'll remember. Now, we're a little bit over time, so everyone, if we can just extend for, this will be the first time we've ever done this, another 2 minutes. Peter's question, is there a good way to get board value from dedicated contrarians?
Yeah, so this is a pre-prepared answer, so I'll race through it because we did get that one through before the webinar, and thank you for that question. Handling contrarian board is really challenging, and we talked about the role of the chair to create those conditions for the diversity of thought with the sole aim of that better decisions and better stewardship. My thoughts on this are, you have to always encourage open, respectful communication, all board members to share their opinions, ideas openly, while also maintaining a culture of respect and professionalism. Listening actively is really important. When a contrarian is speaking, listening actively and trying to understand their perspective. That's true of any board member, but especially for contrarian, acknowledging their points and asking clarification questions to gain a deeper understanding of what their concerns actually are. And I think great directors and chairs as students of that human condition recognize that everyone has different reasons for thinking and acting the way they do. Seeking common ground is really important. Look for areas of agreement and compromise, ways to address a contrarian's concerns while still moving forward with that board agenda and not being paralyzed. Setting clear expectations from day one, clearly communicating what the decision-making processes are, how everybody's involved and how decisions are formalized and where input comes from. And I think really then, especially for chairs, be decisive. Whilst it's really important to view all those viewpoints, and I know we've all brought this up today, like you sometimes a chair just has to move things forward and just say, that's enough of this, we need to move forward. That's tricky in itself because you've also got, with contrarians, you've also got those people who I would call the quiet reflectors, who the natural cadence of a boardroom of quickly getting through an agenda doesn't work. They come back 2 days later and I've just had a new thought based on this new information. And like, how do you include them? That's another topic for another day. But as I mentioned, all of this stuff has to go in that code of conduct that you can keep on referring to. And it's really important that when you're onboarding anybody into a board role, whatever style, they have to be really effectively onboarded so they know and they agree to the way things have to operate in the boardroom.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just draw your attention to the slide here. We've got 2 webinars which are proving to be very popular. The first one on April 13th, which is 7 costly mistakes of board packs and how to fix them. And then a really interesting topic on technology, how technology gets things done in the boardroom. That's on April 27th. All of this can be found on our website, which is the resource center in the webinars area. If you just move to the next slide, the final slide, Lloyd. So, as I mentioned in my opening, you'll receive an email from us very shortly, which will include a recording of today's webinar, the presentation slides, and the topic white paper from Lloyd. Just as you leave, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey, and you'll go into the draw to win our really lovely hamper worth over $400. We'll announce the winner over the next 24 hours. And thanks again, everybody, for coming along today. I know it was an odd day to have a webinar given we've got an Easter weekend, but congratulations to all of you for turning up. I hope you enjoyed the session today. Thanks, Paul, Lloyd, and Susan for your attendance today.